Greetings, heroes. It is I, your friendly neighborhood rabbi, coming back at you after a few days off. Appreciate the patience, everybody, and I know thank you for reaching out to me and saying, hey, when's it going to happen again? And it's happening again right now. So we are jumping into another live studio recording of the Jew Curious show. And how this kind of works is, if you're looking for a 90-second video on, explain Judaism to me on 1 foot, there are other great resources for that. I recommend Rabbi Hillel the Elder, who actually one time famously explained all of Judaism on 1 foot and said, that which is hateful to you, don't do to anybody else. And the rest is commentary. And now go study. and some people interpret that to mean go study the commentary, because it's the commentary where we really unpack that is where it's at. But this is not that. This is not a 90-second video. I've probably been talking for 90 seconds already. What we're doing today is a little bit longer conversation with people who are showing up live, and this is an Ask Me Anything session. And so, much to my surprise, when I started doing these a little while ago, I thought it was going to be just straight up crickets. Like, nobody was going to tune in, nobody was going to watch, nobody was going to ask questions. But these get into some of the most interesting conversations that I've had with people watching, because how this works is, if you're on with me live, you can type your questions into the chat and I will do my level best to answer them. Really help me out a lot if you have a question. If you put a question mark on it, it's easier for me to find in the live chat. And already I see Karen's joining us from Philly. Let's see, Susan's here from Florida. Got a couple of people, David and Taylor, both coming in from Chicago. So I don't know if you guys are in the same room or if you know each other, but welcome, Taylor, David, Taylor. Now you guys can hang out because you both live in Chicago. I know Chicago is kind of a big place, but glad to have you here. Going to clear the pipes out a little bit with some rocket fuel. Alrighty. So let's get into this. And again, this is, God willing, a live studio recording of something that will be put into a podcast later. So I'm going to do some radio announcery stuff to get started with. Hero, do you have any questions about Judaism? I imagine if you're listening to this show, and if you've listened to this show before, or even if this is your first time listening, you have at one time or another had a question about Judaism. This is the Jew Curious show, after all, and I've met a lot of curious people, I'll say, on this show, from the audience and from the people that I've interviewed, people who have sparked my curiosity to learn more about them and to learn more about Judaism, to answer their questions. And so one of my favorite things to do is a session that we call Ask Me Anything. And on today's episode, people in the live studio audience are invited to ask me literally anything about Judaism, about Jewish people, Jewish traditions, which I fully believe helps people from anywhere, which I fully believe can help anyone, anywhere, live a life of greater meaning, joy, human connection, and personal growth. And we'll get into your questions right after this bass. Clear. I got a little static in the line. I hope everybody can hear me okay and see me okay. I don't know what the lag is like. I was looking over some of my old videos, and it seems to be a little bit laggy as far as my mouth moving and the sounds that I make. Doing what I can to correct that. Again, they don't teach you how to live stream in rabbinical school, but I'm working on that too. So we'll see what we can do with the new people coming out of seminary soon. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey, for those inspiring opening beats. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in for our live studio recording session. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious show. Once again, this is a place where Jewish people, where not yet Jewish people, where simply Jew Curious people can learn about traditions that can enable a life of greater meaning, greater joy, greater human connection, and greater personal growth, regardless of where you are coming from. Before we get started with this Ask Me Anything session, I want to give some shout-outs to the people who've showed up live. Let's see, we've got Karen coming in from Philadelphia. Susan is here from Florida. David and Taylor are both from Chicago. Mosiol, or sorry, this is why live studio is fun, because you get to hear all the burps and the bleeps and the bloops, and maybe this will be edited out of the podcast, maybe not. We'll see how lazy I am today. Carrie's coming in from Tennessee, says, Hi, Carrie, good to see you. Nicola B. is a recent convert, she says, and she's getting married in August. Mazel tov. So good to hear, Nicola. Glad to have you here. Dale is coming in from Atlanta, Georgia, presumably. I don't know a lot of other Atlantas. I know a lot of Athenses. I think every state has an Athens. My grandmother lived in Athens, Texas. I spent a good part of my youth in Athens, West Virginia. And there's an Athens, Georgia. But Dale's not from there. Dale's from Atlanta. Carla, good to see you. Coming in from Arcadia. Miriam from New Hampshire. And Michael is here. He says, a live stream. I feel like it's been forever. And it's been forever. I think it's been like a week, maybe a week and a half. And I appreciate everybody letting me take a little bit of a break from this, a bit of a breather. I'll share with some folks. You may have heard this on the show before, but I did some real soul searching during Passover. I kept asking people the question when I was teaching about Passover: what is your personal Egypt? What is the thing that binds you now that you would like to move away from with a little bit of courage and a lot of help from your friends? And I'll say the one thing that's been, there's a little case in point. One thing that's been my personal Egypt that I'll share with y'all is my health. Over the last few months, I've been really focused on building a school, the Jew Curious School, online, as well as teaching as much Torah as I possibly can, live whenever I can, on the internet and in person here in Southern California. And when I get focused like that on my work, I often don't put my health first. And if you've heard me on the podcast, especially if you've seen me in the live sessions, you know that I have a bit of a cough. And I've had a cough since, I'll say, August. I've had a cough since August, and I don't know. I don't know where I don't know exactly where it's coming from. I've heard a few different things, but a couple of weeks ago, I think my first interruption in the live schedule was to visit a cardiologist, just to make sure that it wasn't something with my ticker. And Dr. Eisenberg ran me through a battery of tests. I highly recommend Dr. Eisenberg, by the way, near St. Joe's Providence here in Burbank. And if you have some questions about your ticker, this is the guy to talk to. He is a mensch. He is a good dude. Give me a hug. He gave me a hug. I hope I'm not calling him out for like a surgical review board or something, but we really hit it off, and took some blood tests, took a chest x-ray, did one of those stress tests, and I think I passed. It was stressful. If it was stressful for me, does that mean I passed? But it took a little stress test. So far, all the things are coming back positive, but I see him again in about a week to really go over it, trying to figure out what's going on with my health, but also just really focusing on fixing my diet, doing some more exercise, a little bit of Bikram yoga, a little bit of hot yoga. I don't know if anybody's into yoga or being hot, but if you like either of those things or both of those things, I highly recommend it. So taking a little time for me because of that, and appreciate everybody's indulgence. Hopefully it means that I'll be around to teach Torah to as many people as I can for a long time to come. We got Robert coming in from Canada. Thank you for tuning in from Toronto. Robert, nice to have you here from Toronto, Canada. Let's see what kind of questions we have to start with. A little bit of a lag. Hopefully we can fix that in future broadcasts. Our first question today comes from Karen in Philadelphia. She says, "Hi, everyone. Trying to learn Mishnah before Daf Yomi starts again in January. Any recommendations for English editions?" So it just so happens, before I give you my recommendation, I just want to spell out a couple of Hebrew words that Karen asked in her question for the people who are still learning. Mishnah is the sort of first pass, we'll say, at written down rabbinic literature. It comes from the oral Torah, or you might have heard of the Torah Shabbal Peh, which means the oral tradition of Torah. Our tradition holds that when God gave Moses and the Jewish people the Torah, it came in two versions. One was the Torah Shabbat, the written Torah, that body of work that Moses, according to our tradition, transcribed or took dictation from God and wrote it all down. But at the same time, while God was giving the Torah, God was also explaining things to Moses. Said, in the future, people are going to ask questions. This is a very concise book. It doesn't spell out exactly how to do everything that I ask of you. And so I'm going to explain the different things to you, Moses, and you tell Joshua, who was kind of Moses's second in command there for a while, and then Joshua is going to explain it to people. The reason for this is that if we wrote every single thing down, first off, you couldn't carry that book. I mean, we're talking about a stone tablet here to start with. You couldn't carry all that with you, and new generations may need new ways to interpret what is in the Torah. And so I'm going to explain it to you in a way that you understand it, and you explain it to Joshua in a way that Joshua is going to understand it, and so on. And that became, later on, the Mishnah. After there was this kind of historical crisis, sort of the Roman domination of Judea, was what they called their little area there, which was the ancestral home of the tribe of Yehuda. So the first rule of Torah Shabbal Peh is that you don't write down Torah Shabbal Peh, right? They said this is an oral tradition. You never, ever write this down. Just have a bunch of people memorize this stuff, and then when you want to learn it, you can have the people who memorized it, also known as the Tanaim or the repeaters, repeat it to you, and you could talk about it, but you're not supposed to write it down. However, in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era, when Rome governed Judea, the area in and around Jerusalem, it was hard for our people. It was hard for this emergent group known as Rabbinic Jews, because Torah teaching and Torah learning were outlawed. The people who violated that were killed, including many of these Tanaim, including many of these people who had vast tracts of law memorized. And so they broke the first rule of oral Torah and actually wrote some of it down so they wouldn't lose it. And that became what is known as the Mishnah. That's what Karen is attempting to study right now. We still have this. It's about a 6-volume set. It comes in sort of 6 orders of the Mishnah with many tractates or sub-volumes in there explaining all different aspects of Jewish life and Jewish law as it was written down in, let's say, the 2nd century of the Common Era, about 1800 or so years ago. And she's saying, how do I get this done before Daf Yomi starts? Now, Daf Yomi is another method of Jewish study. The words Daf Yomi mean a page a day. And many years ago, I think it's about 70 and change years ago, there was a rabbi, a teacher of Torah, who decided that a good way to study was to study the Talmud 1 page a day. And by 1 page, it wasn't 1 page like we think of in a book. It was actually a front and back, or a folio page, as the bookbinders call it. And so he said, if you take this vast literature known as the Talmud, which is about the size of a set of encyclopedia on the bookshelf, roughly, and he said, if you study a front and back page a day, you can learn the entire Talmud in only 7 years or so. It's like 7 years and change, 7 years and a couple of months, I think. But this became a thing. And he said, okay, everybody, and he just started with his students and said, let's commit to learning a page of Talmud a day, and so that we will, each of us, have read the entire Talmud and studied as deeply as we can in this rapid schedule over the course of 7 years. And he started this, again, 70 plus years ago. And then once they finished that cycle, this cycle started again. And it wasn't, every individual start wherever they want to, whenever they want to. They said, let's all do it on the same schedule so that when the cycle starts, everybody around the world who's participating in this, and it is a worldwide endeavor, will study the same page on a given day. And there are calendars out there. Just search for DAF, D-A-F, space Yomi, Y-O-M-I, online, and you can find the DAF Yomi calendar. You can see on any given day what is the page being studied by people who are following this. And this started again in the last century. With each cycle, more and more people have learned about it. More and more people have undertaken it. A couple of my teachers that I know have done this, Reb Mimi Feigelson, who now teaches at Machon Schechter in Israel and was one of my teachers in rabbinical school, and also Rabbi Brad Artson, a few cycles ago, undertook this. He's the dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, my dean for my seminary education, continues to be my teacher to this day, still learning from him, been out of school for a few years now, but he's undertaken this as well. And I'll even admit that I tried approximately 7 years ago, and I know this because my daughter is about to turn 7. And the last, or the current, I should say, Daf Yomi cycle began about a month before she was born. Or maybe it was like a couple of days after she was born, but right about the same time. And so I sat down, I thought, I'm going to do this. I've got the Talmud in front of me. I'm going to commit to this learning. It takes about an hour or so a day. And a few days into that, I'm sitting in Rabbi Artson's office. Don't worry, I didn't get in trouble. So somebody invites his students to come to the dean's office whenever we want to talk about something. And something that was weighing heavily on my mind was I just wasn't able to keep up. And what he also knew about me was that I had a newborn in the house. And he said, John, I think you should try the next cycle because Daf Yomi, especially to a newer student of Talmud, which I was back then, is a significant undertaking. And it's generally good advice not to undertake anything significant with a newborn in the house. So he says, tell you what, learn what you need to learn for your schooling, for your teaching and things like that. Don't start Daf Yomi now. Start at the next cycle. And as Karen is pointing out, the next cycle, now that my daughter's about to turn 7, means another cycle is coming up. The next Daf Yomi cycle begins in January. And so Karen is looking to study the Mishnah, which is sort of the core or kernel upon which the Talmud is based. So once again, they wrote down the oral Torah in about the year, they say the span is like 120 to 200 of the Common Era. And once it was all written down, they said, fine, great, we wrote this whole thing down. But being rabbis, being learned Jews, being Jew-curious people, they kept talking about it. They kept discussing it, and they wrote commentary on it. And they had more verbal commentary and more written commentary because they were writing stuff down now. And over the next 200, 300, 400 years, they compiled additional commentary on the Mishnah. That commentary became what's called the Gemara. And once, let's say, book printing became popular in kind of the Middle Ages, late medieval period, they started putting together these volumes of the Mishnah and the Gemara, that is the Mishnah and the commentary on the Mishnah combined, and that's what the Talmud is. And so, if you study the Mishnah, you're studying everything that the Talmud is talking about. And then once you start studying the Talmud, you can go back and learn different rabbis' opinions on what's in the Mishnah. And so studying the whole of the Mishnah, or studying any Mishnah is good, but studying the whole of the Mishnah is a great way to prepare for Daf Yomi, because you're going to get an idea of what's the kind of stuff that they talk about. How do they talk about it, which is really significant, and I'll say different, in among religious writings. The Mishnah is a unique thing, because it not only just lays out the general rules of the road or the general procedure or even the most popular It will list the most popular way of approaching a certain aspect of Jewish thought or practice, but then it will list other things as well. It will list, let's say, minority opinions, which, you don't read a lot of religious texts that say, okay, this is a way to do it, and here are 3 other ways to do it that different teachers have come up with. And so this is a long way of answering Karen's original question, which is, what is a good English translation? I'll say I don't have a really updated one, but I'm sure there are updated ones available. This is what I use when I'm, studying Mishnah. Sometimes I have a volume that's just straight up in Hebrew, but you're not asking for that. This is called the Blackman Mishnah. So it's an edition that was compiled by a guy named Philip Blackman, Blackman. You can probably find some version of it online, and it's a multi-volume set. It covers the entirety of the Mishnah, and I got this one from the free books on the library cart back in seminary, and it has Hebrew and English side by side. So this is Masechet Bechorot, first fruits, things like that. And it's got the Mishnah there in Hebrew, and it's got a translation into English. Now, this was done quite some time ago, so you might find the translation a little bit archaic. This is from 1954 when this was done. But it's really handy because it's not just a translation. It's got a lot of footnotes kind of explaining those translations, giving other sources to look at if it refers to a passage in the Tanakh or in the Torah. You can find it here. It has a lot of great commentary in English as well. So this is my go-to English translation of the Mishnah. And again, I like it, even though I like studying in the original, but I also like the translation because it's got a lot of good footnotes to it, pointing to various things. And that's helpful because, like the Torah, the Mishnah, even though it's much longer, is a very concise text. It's written in, I'll say, legal jargon, because it'll describe things in ways that only people who are really studying the law regularly will get. What's the first sentence in the Mishnah is they ask the question, from when can we say, or they ask the question, from what time in the evening can we begin to say the evening Shema? And the first answer given is, from the time at which the Kohanim enter to eat their donations that have been given to them until the end of the first watch. And so, again, this is all in legal jargon. First off, you have to know what the Shema is, and that's a particular prayer that's very important in our liturgy. And then you have to know who the Kohanim are, who the priests are. You have to understand that they mostly ate by people making donations to the temple. When people would set aside their first fruits, would set aside different tithes, if you will. This is how the priests ate. And you also had to understand that they couldn't eat those donations if they were in a state of ritual impurity. And so when it says from the time that they come in, meaning the time that they're able to come in, having immersed in the mikveh and waited until sundown, and then you have to understand what the first watch means. And so you have to know a little bit about classical and medieval history and the government of walled cities and how people took watches guarding the walls of the cities. So it's in a lot of sort of very concise legal jargon, and that's why it's really helpful to have something with commentary, something with footnotes that unpacks all of these things for you. And short answer, Karen, is look for a set of Blackman Mishnah, and just type in Blackman Mishnah in Amazon or Google, and God willing, you'll find something. If you're having a little trouble, I may know some sources that you can get it from, so just ping me and I'll help you out. Let's see what other questions we have today. Great question, Karen. It explained a lot of rabbinic literature and Jewish thought just answering that question. Let's see. Susan asks, question. Susan asks, during prayers, there is a point at which the congregation bows toward the right and the left. I'm interested to understand what that's all about. You and me both, Susan. I understand what you're talking about. I don't know exactly where it comes from, but my understanding is that it comes from a particular tradition that we've had for quite some time as to how we bow and when we bow. And I'll say up front that, Susan's obviously been in a congregation where people are standing during a prayer and they bow, and they don't just bow forwards, they bow to the right and to the left and to the middle, or actually it's usually like left, right, and the middle. And then they may bend at the knees slightly and then get up and then bow. So Jewish choreography, if you will, is pretty intricate. And I don't know of a single text that describes sort of what the source is of this. However, my understanding is that this emerged historically as we were developing modes of prayer and as we were in transition from worshiping God by sacrificing animals at the temple to prayer. And this was in the first, probably started in the first Babylonian this probably started in the Babylonian exile right after the destruction of the first temple, when the early rabbis were devising, okay, how do we stay connected to God even though our main way of connecting to God isn't available to us anymore? And they said, well, instead what we're going to do is we are going to have a prayer service that substitutes for sacrifices. And so the reason Jews traditionally pray 3 times a day, or 4 times on holidays, or 5 times on Yom Kippur, is that this is the frequency of sacrifices when we had the temple. And so there would be a morning or shacharit sacrifice. There would be an afternoon grain offering in the temple, and the word for the grain offering was mincha, and that's the name of our afternoon service today. It doesn't mean afternoon, it means grain. And then there would be a time where, anything that was kind of left over was burned after dark until morning. And so we have what is called Ma'ariv or Arvit, which means evening time stuff. And so now, instead of sacrificing in the morning, making a grain offering in the afternoon, and then burning off the rest of that which was sacrificed at night, we have morning, afternoon, and evening prayers. And then on Shabbat and holidays, there would be an additional sacrifice, so we have an additional prayer service. And then on Yom Kippur, there's the most. We have 5 of those. And specifically, the bit of liturgy that survives and is still being used frequently today, 3 times a day, is the Amidah, or the standing prayer, also called the Shemona Esrei, because at one point it contained 18 blessings, and Shemona Esrei means 18. Actually, several years ago, one of the blessings was split in 2, so technically our 18 blessing prayer has 19 blessings in it. But this prayer, the Amidah, the standing prayer, was specifically designed to stand in for sacrifice at the temple. That's why we only say Shema in the morning and the evening, but not in the afternoon. We say the Amidah every time we have a prayer service, morning, afternoon, and evening. And just like in the days of the temple where the priests would approach the holy presence, we are to see ourselves as approaching a holy presence whenever we say the Amidah. And so that is the source of the particular choreography of this prayer. And there's left bowing and right bowing and front bowing, but there's a few other things to it that come from this notion. They said, you know what? When we are praying in substitute for sacrifices, we are nevertheless approaching the Holy One. We are approaching the sovereign of our lives. And so they modeled the choreography of this prayer after how a subject of a monarchy would approach the king. Right? And this is frequently used as a metaphor for God, or we talk about Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, but we often talk about God as a king, or the King of Kings of Kings. And so the only appropriate or most appropriate embodiment of that in the material world was how would a lowly subject of the realm approach the king, right? We didn't have a metaphor for God. We didn't have an image of God. But when we thought about the most powerful person that we knew, the person who was perhaps most distant from us in terms of access, who had complete say over our lives, and we didn't get a lot of chances for rebuttal or voting him out or anything like that, it was the king. So they thought, okay, how does one approach a king in court settings that were contemporary to them? And they said, first, you approach the king with intention. You just come right in. One rule about talking to kings is nobody puts their back to the king. You have to walk in forward. And so this is why when people stand up for the Amidah or standing prayer, you'll see them take 3 steps back and then 3 steps forward. This is because, first off, you need to take these 3 intentional steps forward, but sometimes to have room for that, you need a little bit of a runway, especially if you're in a packed synagogue on Yom Kippur. So we take 3 steps back and 3 steps forward, and then there's a special kind of bow where we bend at the knee and bow. And so it's hard to describe this just with the sound of my voice, but you can see people doing this. They take a little bend at the knee and then stand upright, and then they bow forward. In the beginning of the Amidah, in the first of the 19 blessings, and then at the close of that blessing, they will bow to the left and to the right and to the center. This is sort of an enhancement of that bow, right? And this acknowledges that the king isn't just right in front of you. The king has dominion over everything. So you don't just bow in one direction. You bow in sort of multiple directions, acknowledging the extension of that king's sovereignty. And this is also done not just at that point in the Amidah, it's also done at the end of the Amidah where, again, nobody turns their back on the king. You got to walk out backwards when you're in the presence of the king or queen, as the case may be. And so you'll see people take, at the very end of that prayer, 3 steps back again, and then they'll do this sort of tripartite bow once again, left, right, and center, and then conclude the Amidah. This happens another time. You'll often see people doing this during the Kaddish prayer, or the Kaddish, depending on how you pronounce it. And at the very last line, Oseh Shalom B'Mromav, like the one who makes peace in the universe, please make peace for us and for all of Israel and all of the people of the world. And concluding this, people will again do that. Bow to the left, bow to the right, bow to the center, bend at the knee, and bow. And that is a conclusion of another prayer that's very holy to us. The idea when you're praying is you should pray as if you are in the presence of a monarch, as metaphor, right? But you should act as you would act in front of the most powerful and honored person that you know. That's the closest we can get in a physical world to understanding the presence of God. Once again, it's a metaphor. If you have if you're more of a small d Democrat and you're not into this whole monarchy thing, again, this was how people related to God in a time when the most powerful person that they knew was a monarch, and so they used this metaphor. But that's where all that choreography comes from. If you're learning how to do this, there's a great book by Rabbi Donin, Donin, called To Pray as a Jew. Sometimes it's hard to get. I tried to order it for a few people recently, and I had to wait. Even on Amazon, it was on back order. But that's a book that I recommend. However, there's no substitute for live practice. And so I learned a lot about prayer from this book. I learned how to pray by attending synagogue, by going to services, and by copying the people around me. And so if you can find a place to pray where other Jews are praying who look like they know what they're doing, don't be afraid to sort of sit in the back and observe, but then try out the things that they are doing. And over time, this will become second nature to you, right? I know that I see people now, and I experience this, that whenever they're saying those things, those blessings that we bow to, it's become sort of reflexive in my muscle memory that I can't say those words without doing that left, right, and center bow myself. So it just takes a lot of practice, and I really hope you have the opportunity to do that. So great question, Susan. When I teach about Jewish prayer in the Miller Introduction to Judaism program, the whole chapter specifically devoted to Jewish prayer and synagogue services is called "When Do I Bow?" So props to Rabbi Adam Greenwald for that frequently asked question. So just going to take a little pause here. I know this is bad radio. Good to see Trig is joining us. I'm going to take a little pause here to look into the chat to see what questions people have. Again, if you have a question, if I miss it, feel free to put it in the chat again. Make sure there's a question mark on it. It makes it easier for me to see. Grycicle is giving me advice about hot yoga might be stressful with the heat, so be careful. Apparently my stress test came back okay. I'm going to see what the doctor says. Another possible candidate for my let's say 8-month cough could be something called valley fever, which I've heard about, which is just a kind of a persistent cough people get from living in the San Fernando Valley because of smog and wildfires and all kinds of stuff. So apparently that just kind of goes away on its own after about a year or so, it seems. Let's see what other questions people have. Taylor asks, how did the tradition of men wearing a kippah develop? So what's interesting to me is that the kippah or you might hear it called the yarmulke, this little cap, one time I was at a coffee shop and a woman in Minneapolis said to me, it was a Minneapolis coffee shop, so she belonged there too. But she said, "Oh, look, you're wearing a little Jewish hat." And I thought that was hilarious. I was on my way to a class. I was wearing a kippah. And she says, "You've got a little Jewish hat on, don't you?" And so sometimes I call it my little Jewish hat. But this is one of the most easily identifiable external signifiers or pieces of holy clothing that people around the world see that hat on somebody, that little head covering, and say, that's a Jewish person. And so you might be curious to find out that at no point in the Torah does it tell us that we have to wear a little circular dome-shaped thing called a yarmulke or a kippah. It does tell us about other things to wear. It tells us about putting fringes on the corners of our garment. These are the kind of long knotted strings that you'll see in the corners of a talit or a prayer shawl. Back before prayer shawls, people just put these on their clothes because they wore four-cornered garments all the time, right? Most of what they were wearing was what we would think of today as like a toga. And so nowadays, because we don't wear a lot of four-cornered garments, except maybe a shawl or a poncho or something like that, we have round clothing. And so we can't put those tzitzit on round clothing. So what we do is we fashioned a four-cornered garment to wear tzitzit, and it tells us to do this in the Torah, right? In the passages of the Torah referred to in the Shema, it says you should wear these things. And yet, you probably see more people wearing a kippah on the street than you will wearing these fringes that come out of some people's pants in religious neighborhoods, because they're wearing these four-cornered things under their shirts and let the strings out so that they can see it and other people can see it. So fringes are in the Torah. The kippah is not. Another thing that it mentions in the Shema, it's passage from the Torah that's read during the prayer service, is it says, you should bind these words upon your arm and have them as a sign before your eyes. And this is where we get tefillin from. The worst translated word, or most hilarious, I don't even know what this word means, but it's they're often called phylacteries. So if you see something about Jews wearing phylacteries, that's a kind of Greek loanword into English describing talismans or something like that. In Jewish talk, we call them tefillin. Again, this is a thing that we're told to wear, right? We're told to wear tefillin at points in the day. We're told to wear fringes on the corners of our four-cornered garments, but we're never told that you got to walk around wearing a kippah. This is something that emerged over time. And let's say one of the earliest conversations we see about this is in the Talmud, where people are talking about whether it's appropriate to cover your head when you pray. And people are saying, yes, you should cover your head when you pray. Some people do, some people don't. And then they mentioned in that text, I don't have it off the top of my head where the text was, but the rabbis were debating, okay, when should you cover your head? And it was roundly agreed that you should cover your head when you're praying, because this shows kind of deference to God, reminds you that God is present when you are praying, and some would say all the time. Then some slightly more strict rabbis said, well, you should also cover your head when you're eating, because if you're doing it right, if you're eating in kind of a holy way, you're saying a blessing before you eat something, and that's like prayer. So you should cover your head when you're praying, and you should cover your head when you are eating, because eating engenders prayer. But there was this one weirdo, and they called him a weirdo. They said, there's one guy who's more strict than anybody, and he covers his head all the time. But that's not the usual way of doing things. That's just this one fringe character. This one super punctilious rabbi that we know covers his head all the time. And when you get to later discussions of this, a few hundred years on, Maimonides talks about this and says, yes, some people cover their head when they're praying. And Maimonides says, I think you should cover your head when you're praying. And also eating, because it engenders prayer. But that's really the only times you have to cover your head. So even in Maimonides' time, it wasn't common for, and this is about 1,000 years ago, about 900 or 1,000 years ago, and even in Maimonides' time, it wasn't common for people to have their heads covered constantly. It was only later in the Shulchan Aruch, circa 17th century of the Common Era, that they took the most strict opinion that they could find in the Talmud and said, this is going to be our norm, right? People should have their heads covered all the time. A person should not walk more than dalat amot, shouldn't walk more than 4 cubits without his head covered. And I'll acknowledge here that they were talking about men, because most of the rules they were talking about, the things that you have to do, they were focused on men doing these things, because it was mostly men studying the Torah and writing these books about the Torah. So they weren't really concerned with women covering their heads, but they were mostly talking about men. And that's why in some communities you'll see men wear a kippah all the time, but women never do. Women may cover their hair for different reasons, but that has much more to do with modesty and family laws and things like that. It's not the same reason that men cover their heads. And so I'm going to say that it became a trend among the most strict observers of Jewish ritual to cover their heads constantly during the medieval period. And now today, this is considered the proper Jewish thing to do, but it's not acknowledged anywhere that, yes, this thing that seems to identify people as Jewish or not Jewish, whether they have their head covered or not, comes from the most strict interpretation of the most strict rabbi of the Talmud. So if you imagine people walking around with their heads covered in the time of the Talmud and in the time of the Torah, it wasn't a thing. It was one fringe opinion that became normative Judaism in a time and place where stricter was considered superior, better, closer to God. And I'll just say to everybody out there, that is one way of doing things. It is not the only or even normative way of doing things necessarily. I personally usually walk around with my head covered. Sometimes it's with a kippah, like this. Sometimes it's just with a ball cap. This is part of my religious practice to keep my head covered. I don't do it. I don't keep my head covered in the shower. I don't keep my head covered when I go to the gym or hot yoga, even though I think I can safely say I acknowledge God's presence in the gym. And a lot of praying happens there sometimes, especially when I pull something. But I don't cover my head in the gym. I don't cover my head when I'm doing exercise or swimming, because the kippah would just get schmutzy, right? And I do know people who go to the gym and put on like a do-rag or put on a kippah, especially for the gym. I don't personally do that. But when I'm not in some sort of strenuous circumstance, I usually have my head covered. Part of it's just so that people know who I am. If people need to find another Jew in the area, or find a rabbi to learn with, or find just another Jew to make minyan, they can look at me across the street and say, hey, you, come over here. We need a tenth. That's just, again, a personal decision on my part. So no judgments if you're not ready to wear a kippah all the time, but that's where it comes from. It comes from a strict opinion in the Talmud that was still considered a minority position in the time of Maimonides, but only in the later medieval period did it become the did it become normative practice for religious communities. Okay, let's see. What are the questions we have here? We're going to go for about another 10 minutes or so. Karen's Karen's asking me, just found PDFs, would like codices if possible. How do I ping you? I'll just say put a comment in the Jew Curious Community Center on Facebook. When I see that, I'll see if I can cut and paste a link to a particular online Jewish bookstore that's my favorite. Miriam's asking for another thing having to do with Jewish choreography. When people rise up on their toes, and I've answered this question before, and I asked people just because it was funny to type tippy toes into the chat, and people did, and that was hilarious. I think that was like our first Ask Me Anything session. So there's another practice during the Amidah to rise up on your toes 3 times. This is done during the Kedusha, a certain period of the Amidah, and often people will rise up on their toes again 3 times when they end the Amidah. And this comes from, I believe, a section of Isaiah. And I was just looking over this recently because I have another daughter who's going to be bat mitzvah in a couple of years, and I was looking up her Haftarah, and I believe it's cited in there in Isaiah. There is a description of the heavenly court and angels praising God and rising up, and there's a part of the Kedusha prayer where we are quoting that passage. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavot, Melech Kol Haaretz Kvodo. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, and God's glory fills the whole world. This is a part of the Kedusha, a part of this section of the Amidah, and it's a quotation from the book of Isaiah. And in the context, this isn't people talking to God in Isaiah. This is Isaiah's vision of angels talking to God. And so when we quote this passage of Isaiah in the Kedusha, we imitate angels. And how do you imitate angels? Angels are flying beings. This particular group of angels, they're flying around God on their angel wings. And so we can't fly. I don't know if anybody out there can fly. I could use a ride to San Luis Obispo here in a couple of weeks. But anyway, we can't fly. But what we do is we rise up on our toes 3 times when we say Kadosh, 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 sort of elevating ourselves in imitation of these angels who were praising God. And then it became a custom later to add this little 3-time toe rise to the concluding bow of the Amidah as well. Some people do that, some people don't. But it's kind of a reflection of that tippy toe move in the Kedusha, which is done because we are imitating angels when we are praising God. Let's see. I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then I'll have to sign off. And maybe if I don't answer questions today, if I miss them today, we'll be having more sessions next week than we had this week. So if I didn't answer them today, make sure you write your questions down, and we'll get to them next week if I don't get to them today. Vanessa is asking about another prayer. Is the Modeh Ani only said in the morning upon awakening? And so I'll say, traditionally, yes. This is of the traditional Jewish liturgy. There is a prayer that we say upon waking in the morning called the Modeh or Modah Ani. Modah is the feminine version. If you are a female identifying person, you would say Modah Ani, or a male would say Modeh Ani. That's just Hebrew is a gender language, and it conjugates that way. And it's basically saying, I thank God, or I acknowledge God for taking care of me while I was sleeping and restoring my soul to me, and so that I can wake up and face another day. And so that is typically said in the morning. And you don't really see it in the liturgy at all after that as a daily thing. It's a special thing that you say when you wake up in the morning. Does that mean it's forbidden to say it? Is it forbidden to thank God for giving us strength at other parts of the day? Absolutely not. But the only time it appears in the traditional order of Jewish prayer is when you first wake up in the morning. And you can absolutely say it if something else, nice happens during the day. But take a good look at the text just to see if it's appropriate for you. We are specifically thanking God for allowing us to wake up again. And it was thought that when people were sleeping, their souls departed and went someplace else. And if you went to sleep and didn't wake up, that meant your soul had departed permanently. And so what we do when we wake up is we say, hey, my soul came back, and I have God to thank for that. And so we specifically praise God at that time. There are other blessings that you can say when good things happen, when you're grateful for something. You can always say Baruch Hashem, bless God. That's always true. And find specific ways of describing those blessings. Can you say Modeh Ani when you wake up from a nap? Maybe. Right? If you were asleep and you wake up again and you're happy about that, Modeh Ani is a good thing to say. Traditionally, it's mostly just said first thing in the morning, but I'm not going to stop you from saying it any time of day. In reference to this multi-directional bow, Miriam is asking, isn't the lulav wave to the left, right, and forward also? It's actually done in even more directions. So the bow is not sort of 90 degrees to the left, 90 degrees to the right. Usually it's more of a tight radius there. The lulav is something different, but for a similar reason. When we wave the lulav to all points, sort of in 6 different directions, all the points of the compass and up and down. Left, forward, right, back, up, and down. That's how you wave a lulav. But for a similar reason is that we're acknowledging and it's for a similar reason we are acknowledging the span of the existence, presence, and sovereignty of God in all directions. Again, you can't represent every single direction because you would be bowing everywhere in all points of the 3-dimensional circle. But how we accomplish that is say if we're praying to the east, it would be north, east, south, west, up, and down. That pretty much covers everything. Karen asks, when are the coffee breaks during conservative Shabbat services? When can one duck out? So I'll just say, watch the customs of the people in your synagogue. That's always a good guide. I would say, whether it's bowing or knowing when to stand up or sit down, or knowing when it's acceptable to take a little coffee break or go take care of other biological needs. Just follow what the people do in your synagogue. I would say largely at the major breaks of services between, let's say, the Shacharit morning service and the Torah service is a good time to take a break. Between the Torah service and Musaf, sometimes during the sermon, people get up and go to the bathroom. That's okay with me. I acknowledge their humanity and physical needs, whether it's for a bio break or for coffee. I'm a big coffee drinker myself. I often take a bit of a coffee break during the Torah service myself. Yamen is asking, hello, Rabbi, can you talk about women hair covering? Are married women supposed to cover their hair? So this varies a lot by the Jewish community that you are a part of or seek to be a part of or are familiar with. So there is a custom sort of universally of human modesty, right? We should not go around flaunting our nakedness at places. There's a time that's appropriate to be naked. There's a time that it's appropriate to share our complete beauty with another person. But for the most part, we like to observe a tradition of modesty. And that means that any synagogue you go into, and I could be wrong, there could be, let's see, that could be wrong. There could be naturist synagogues out there where people go completely naked. Not my bag, not my cup of tea, but you do you. But for the most part, people will cover their bodies, and in some communities, a very on sort of the Orthodox end of the spectrum, but not exclusively. Orthodox people do this. Women will cover their hair out of modesty because their hair is considered part of their beauty that is reserved for their marital relationship. And so in these communities where women cover their hair, women won't start covering their hair really until after they're married. And so young girls, young women, or unmarried women will have their hair uncovered. And it's usually only upon marriage will a woman start to cover her hair. And this hair covering can range from kind of a simple cloth that doesn't cover the hair completely. There's still some hair out, but there's a cloth covering part of the head that just acknowledges that, okay, I'm not going to reveal my total beauty to anybody except the person that I'm married to, so I cover my hair. This can go all the way to the extreme of covering all of one's hair, meaning a full head wrap, to wearing a wig that looks like hair but covers the person's actual hair. In Yiddish, this is called a sheitel. And so in some neighborhoods, some communities, you'll see women wearing wigs covering their natural hair. I have never understood why having a wig that looks like hair is an appropriate covering for hair, especially if some of these wigs are really, especially some of these wigs are really well taken care of and really carefully tended, so they may actually look nicer than the person's hair. I don't know. But that is a custom that has emerged, that women would cover their hair, and sometimes women would cover their hair with other hair. But it is, again, it's not for the same reason that men in that community might wear kippot, who are sort of acknowledging the presence of God. Women covering their hair is more about modesty and the sanctity of their marriage or their exclusive relationship. So that's a different reason, and it's done after they get married. Robert asks, can I trim my beard? I'm going to say, yes, you can, Robert. There are some Jewish cultures in which beards are not trimmed at all, left totally out to grow, because of a line in the Torah that says you shouldn't cut the corners of your beard. And so some people have decided that, well, a corner of the beard means the ends of the hair, so I'm not going to cut it at all. Beards are just sort of let to grow naturally and never ever cut. Again, this is a very small minority of Jewish people in general among Haredi communities. It's not necessarily an Orthodox thing because not all Orthodox Jews observe this, who are able to grow beards. For the Orthodox communities where before beards became all the rage in the more fundamentalist sects, men would trim their beards and men would shave in a certain fashion. Now, within those communities that say don't cut the corners of your beards, they would take a look at this as, okay, what does it mean to cut? And they said, well, you can cut it as with scissors, but you can't cut it with a razor. You're not allowed to scrape your face with a singular blade. And so in many very traditionally observant communities, men will shave, but they'll shave with a beard trimmer that operates like scissors rather than a single blade, or one of these rotating head electric razors, which is what I use. That's considered scissors and not a blade. And so I haven't shaved my face with a blade in many years. In fact, probably can't tell in the video, I haven't shaved at all today. I was in kind of a rush this morning. But when I do shave, and I shave just about every day except for Shabbat and holidays, I will, because I don't like, cutting stuff on Shabbat and holidays. But when I do shave, I shave with an electric razor that operates like many small pairs of scissors, getting very close into your skin, but doesn't operate like a razor blade. So if you want to trim your beard, go right ahead. There are plenty of Jews out there who can grow beards, who choose not to. There are plenty of people who grow beards to a certain length but then trim them. You're not supposed to necessarily be all raggedy looking for the sake of being religious. It's just become I'll say, a tradition among Haredi communities, among, I don't like using the word ultra-Orthodox, but sort of identifying these small groups within Jewish culture that said, you know what, we're going to not cut the corners of our beards, we're not going to cut any of our beards ever, ever, and that's how we identify ourselves, and that's how we know each other out in public. But again, that's a small percentage of the Jewish population. Plenty of guys shave every day. I shave all the time. I have a different reason. I have a kind of a unique reason for shaving. It's because my beard grows in mostly white. And so I look significantly older when I grow a beard. In fact, I look even older than my father-in-law, who's always had a full beard, because my beard is whiter than his. And my wife decided she doesn't want to be married to somebody who looks like her grandpa. So I'm not allowed to grow a beard, and that's why I shave every day, but I do it in a way that's in accordance with halakha or Jewish law by using an electric razor. Greisicle's asking the question about Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba was a leader of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was a group of Jews rebelling against Roman rule. That was finally the last straw for the Romans, and that's when they decided, okay, we're going to destroy the Second Temple and exile most of the Jews from Judea. And so that was the beginning of sort of the great exile or the great diaspora that has fortunately allowed Jews to spread all across the world, but it kept us from having self-governance in the Holy Land for almost 2,000 years. We're back. As of today, in fact, we've been back for 71 years. We are there. We're not going anywhere, and we're going to defend ourselves there. And today is that celebration of independence. So Bar Kokhba was the leader of a failed rebellion that led to our exile. Some people would consider him a hero for fighting against the Romans, not the builder of the Third Temple, because the Third Temple hasn't been built yet, and Bar Kokhba has been lost for a very long time. All right, I think with that, I'm going to wrap up today's podcast. Listen, everybody, I really appreciate people hanging in with me for a little bit of a break. I'm going to be on more frequently in the near future. If you want to know when that's happening, the best thing to do is subscribe to this YouTube channel and checking back frequently whenever I have an updated schedule of what things we'll be talking about when. I think we'll be going on, I'm not exactly sure what schedule we'll be on next week. Have to work it in with my new health regimen and a doctor's appointment that I have, but we'll have these more frequently. So just in the meantime, it's going to be a little bit inconsistent till we lock down a pattern that works for everybody. So just stay tuned, subscribe to the YouTube channel, check out my YouTube page, just YouTube, if you're watching it now, you know where it is, and that'll have when things are upcoming. Milo, very good to see you here today. Really glad Milo could join us from Denmark. Always good to learn with you, brother. I'm really glad you're here. All right, just taking a bit of a pause. We're going to do a little radio podcasty outro. Great questions today in our Ask Me Anything session. It's possible that I missed some in the chat, so save those for next time. We will be doing this again sometime very soon. I want to thank everybody who joined us in the live studio audience. If you would like to be a part of a future live studio recording, the best thing to do is to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube, look for me, Rabbi John Carrier, and you'll see a listing of any and all upcoming live sessions that you can join. Ask your questions live. You know I will answer them live to the best of my ability. And we'll continue, and I'll be delighted to continue learning with you. And finally, I want to thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. A great way to stay connected to this community is to find the Jew Curious Community Center on Facebook. And the best way to get access to that is to go to jewcurious.show/JCC. That stands for Jew Curious Community Center. Go to that link, sign up for the Jew Curious Community Center. You will get instructions on how to join this private, carefully tended, lovingly guarded to be troll-free Facebook community where you can connect with Jew Curious people just like you. Once again, it's been my great honor to learn with you today, and until next time, hero, peace. All right, everybody, thank you for learning with me today, and be delighted to learn with you again soon. We will be back for some live session tomorrow. Haven't scheduled exactly the right time. It won't be at 9 a.m. because my kids have a thing at their school that I need to go watch them dance, and so I'll be there. But sometime tomorrow, we'll be talking about the Parashat HaShavua, the Torah portion of the week. So check back later today or early tomorrow on this YouTube page to see when that's going to be. Love it if you would join us. If you can't join us, you can always watch the replays, and really delighted to learn with you again. Thanks to everybody for showing up. Until next time, heroes, peace.